Appreciate it. Sound quality okay? Folks can hear me?
Sounds great.
Good. So yeah, thank you, David. Thanks to the excellent work that you and Rebecca do. You guys have grown NMPAN into so much more than when Lauren and I started it many years ago. And so it's nice to be here with you all. Hope you all are having a good morning, good afternoon. And I am going to talk the sort of advertised aspect, really focusing on some accounting things today. I was going to give an overview talking about chart of accounts initially, and I can also do a little thing on how to analyze purchasing a major piece of equipment. But the floor and the format, as I understand it, is really to have questions from you all. So I'm just going to sort of give a little bit overview about how I think of developing a chart of accounts. I know that this is a time of year as people are starting, wrapping up their books from last year and looking at how their financial performance is, that they're looking at their chart of accounts. And one of the things I would say, I am always paring down a chart of accounts. I think it's really easy for the chart of accounts to continue to sprawl and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I find that it's sort of like housekeeping and clutter. And my goal is always to how can I get rid of line items? And the question that I really try to use as the guiding factor is sort of as same thing as I use around the house is, have I used this line item recently? Is this line item a thing that I actually do something with? And if the answer is no, then I try to see if I can get that line item and fold it into something else. And if you use QuickBooks, you can't delete a line item if it has history. Folks probably know that. You need to make it inactive, which is the solution. You just make it inactive and you stop using that line item and moving forward. So I'm going to do a little screen share and walk you guys through a sort of chart of accounts. There are still quite a few lines because nobody has I've yet to see somebody who has the 10 account chart of accounts. Well, God, wouldn't that be nice? But this is one that is actually pretty close to one that we use in a real business. So my background, I've been involved in running and operating meat processing plants for a long time. Currently, I am just a director of a meat processing plant in Claremont, New Hampshire, Granite State Packing Co-op. So I'm not hands-on all day, every day as I once was, but for over a decade, that was what I did. So let me pull up the screen share thing, and hopefully folks can see this. David, can you see that?
I can. And while Arion's talking, just wanted to let everyone know, I forgot to mention, if you have a question, please, we want all questions today. So you can pop those into the chat box, or you can use the raise your hand function under the reactions button. Anytime you have a question, please, let's spark the conversation and I'll call on you. And yeah. No dumb questions here whatsoever. We're all here to co-learn. So if you're thinking it, someone else probably is too.
Great. Thanks, David. So, starting off this is this chart of accounts. I'm going to go through and there's a lot of accounts in here that I might just sort of gloss over. The key ones that I want to point out are ones that I think are helpful to really look. There's obviously a certain number of accounts that everybody just needs. If you have a checkings and a savings account, you need those as asset line items. That's just how you do it. Accounts receivable, that's a good one. Undeposited funds, some people use that, some people don't. I like to separate equipment into 10-year and 3-year equipment because it is helpful from a depreciation accounting standpoint. So, 10-year equipment is most of your processing equipment, and 3-year equipment is like computers and furniture. And accountants love it, and they will charge you less if these sort of things are kept clean. I also like to use a construction in progress account because if you have a bunch of, let's say you're doing an improvement project, such as refinishing a room or something like that, and you have a bunch of little line item invoices, it's helpful to move them into construction in progress and then move them all over into an asset account as one item. And that is also something your accountant will love because they don't have a bunch of small invoices that they're like, wow, this should be expense. This is not a depreciable asset. They'll want to talk with you about that. This sort of pares down all that conversation to be short and sweet and say, yeah, I got 10 invoices and the grand total of them is $10,000. I posted them all to construction in progress and then I moved them over with a journal entry into 10-year equipment or whatever it is, or building assets or something like that. This company doesn't actually have a building, so you don't see it leases a building, so that's why there's no building asset there. I am a fan of accruals in terms of monthly closings so that you have expenses that you can track by period. And the way I've always done that is by, if a payroll period ends, or excuse me, the end of a month is in the middle of a payroll period, I will accrue that payroll, the portion of it that was back to the month. And then we also, property taxes you only pay once a year, but I like to post an entry every month associated with those so that you don't get slammed all at once. I typically do a monthly closing so that these little monthly items I can really evaluate on a month-to-month basis, and it's helpful to have those expenses. So we do an inventory count. We actually post an inventory asset at the end of the month, and that posting goes against processing supplies and packaging materials so that we can see at our month closing the snapshot of like, here's how the month actually looks standing on its own. Do we get a perfect inventory count every single month? No, just like everybody else, we mess it up all the time, but we do our best. Equity, I like to separate income into different classes and by department. So one of the things, and I've talked about this many times over the years at NMPAN, is trying to get your revenue classes and your your cost of goods classes to line up. So for example, I like to take cutting and slaughter revenue and I like to pair it with cutting and slaughter expenses. And I like to take sausage and curing revenue, and I like to pair it with sausage and curing expenses. These income line items are, I've typically always separated the commercial larger customer accounts from the custom cutting accounts, which doesn't mean custom exempt in my circumstance. It means just the like onesie twosies kind of, and just looking at how those revenues I find it helpful just to see like how business is growing in those categories or not growing, and that's why I do break those out. Grinding, I do have, even though sausage and grinding are one expense or cost of goods set, I have broken out the revenue here. You could criticize me and say, why don't you fold that all in as one in your effort to pare down accounts? And I would accept that as a legitimate criticism. I've recently moved away from trying to condense some of these. I like to put all direct labor as cost of goods. Some people put it as an expense. I really recommended it as a cost of goods so that you can look at gross profit and you can see, here's my direct expense. Because most of us, all of us who are processors who are doing co-packing as like fee for service operations, essentially what we sell is labor. If you have a branded product, that becomes a little more complicated, and that's worth discussing sort of at greater length. But typically, as a fee for service processor, we're selling labor, so I assign all direct labor as a cost of goods. People who solely work in the warehouse, somebody who only works in the front office, I put those down as expenses. But in terms of people who are cutting meat and making sausages, I assign them to cost of goods. I put labor and taxes, like payroll taxes, together. Some people break that out. I find that I don't get any value from breaking it out. That would be one of those examples of used to break it out, don't break it out anymore in an effort to pare things down. I do break out benefits and workers' comp. Workers' comp I find that it's helpful to see those individually, and especially, always try to get the workers' comp rate down. That can be such an expensive thing. Also try to divide processing supplies and packaging materials by department. And sometimes this is harder to do, and where sometimes there are some of these things where I would just advise splitting it as like, okay, well, if it's cardboard, you might be able to say it's 50-50 or it's 60-40 on all the invoices on average, so that when you're doing the entry for the bills, you have a rule of thumb. And maybe you revise that from time to time, but I do not recommend going through every line item on every invoice to allocate those. I recommend just taking a percent that is a good estimate and sticking with that to keep that simple. Cost of quality, that's messing things up. That's when you make mistakes. That's what we post that to. I post that to cost of goods. And we have to buy stuff, buy meat from people. And so we do have a little, warehouse. That's kind of the same thing. Cleaning supplies. These are going to be very much up to you, what you want to do, what you want to keep track of. Do you have a truck? Do you not have a truck? Do you have lab testing expenses? Do you not have lab testing? Now, here's this VistaTrack like this. Maybe you have VistaTrack, maybe you don't. I find it's helpful to split out utilities like this. You have rendering expenses, third-party shipping charges, and then the G&A overhead. I do like to have two categories of expenses, the sort of building expenses, which sort of are part of the whole facility, and then the G&A, which are essentially like the company expenses that are, I think of them as sort of like one is directly related to the building and the other one is not, is related to the corporate entity. That's a logical way that works for me. So that's where things like insurance are related to the corporate entity, legal fees are related to the corporate entity, interest expense and related to the corporate entity, depreciation expense, building and equipment lease. But those could arguably go in the other category. So that is a way that I like to organize some of these things. You know, I this is a list that I always could see at least one or two more accounts that I could pare down, but that is a little bit of how I think about the construction of the chart of the accounts. And when I like to look at 3 months rolling when we close the books so that we can see here's where the expenses are. Here's the P&L for this month. Here's where it was for the last 2 months. How are things lining up? It makes it very helpful to see, are there big jumps or changes? If we have an inventory account where we missed an invoice for, a couple barrels of casings, well, sure, that throws the count quite a bit off, and we can see that there, and we can fix it before we formally close the month. Questions, comments about that?
Yeah, we've got a couple to start. So Adasha asks, is there going to be a chart of account template or a link that the group can view when we get done?
Happy to share this with you, David, if you want. There's no pride of authorship here or anything that's confidential. So happy to just send this as one way that somebody does it.
Sure, and I think NPAN may have a couple others that are kind of freeware, as it were. So, Adasha, yes, we will in the notes on YouTube and where we host it on the website. We will have some links to some resources. So, great question. We will have something for you to actually play around with and use. Next question
Cool.
comes from Caroline. She asks, "Do you consider sanitation labor as part of COGS?"
That's a great question. I probably would put that under the building expenses. We don't have right now in this chart of accounts, we don't have that broken out, but I definitely would say that that's something that I would put as a separate line item where we can do something.
Now, to tack onto that, Arion, if would you consider that the same way if you have outsourced sanitation versus operator-driven sanitation?
I would, yeah, I would, if it's outsourced sanitation is one line, and if it's operator driven sanitation, I probably have the same, same four accounts, which are, labor and taxes, benefits, workers' comp and supplies, which I'm actually just adding in here right now. So that, yeah.
And so you would just be using a time management software or even maybe just a manual calculation of an estimate of how much time is spent on that end of shift sanitation.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood the question. So if I was thinking if you had somebody who was full time, like
Hmm.
that, one or more people who are full time on sanitation, that I would break out their expenses as a building expense. If it's just people cleaning at the end of their shift, I probably wouldn't log it separately. And the reason I would say that is, I I've not found the efforts needed to keep track of that separately to be worthwhile versus the value of the information.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Two more
That's just
questions.
my
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Two questions. First one is, why isn't sanitation part of COGS?
Um, because I can't break it down by department in the same way. In the COGS expenses, I can break those down by department, and I like to try to look at how the departments are performing. So, for example, I don't necessarily do this every month, but I used to be pretty into this, where I would take the revenue from a department and I would take all the expenses associated for the department, and I would look at what the monthly gross profit was that was generated by that department. And in the case of sanitation, I don't have a good way of separating it. So I put it in the expenses after gross profit. That's why.
Okay. And I'm sure there'll be some follow-ups to these, but
Sure.
next question from Ted is, how do you separate the actual payroll by department?
So normally in your payroll software, you have an option of assigning people to departments. I've used some stuff from a local bank. I've used Paychecks. I've used ADP, and all of them usually have a place where you can assign the individual staff people to a department, and then you just run the report that way.
No, if this is a highly manual plant. Let's say we've got 10 to 12 employees, the owner is also the plant manager, everything's super manual, very small establishment.
Mhm.
Any tips for that?
Well, I think yeah, there's a couple ways you can approach that. And this chart of accounts, at Granite State, we've got 9 staff people. This is not a huge facility, but most people work in one department most of the time, and so we assign their wages that way. And that works okay for us. If it's something where somebody works 2 days a week in one area and 3 days a week in the other, well, assign 40%. You can do it as in a spreadsheet, drop the numbers into, you can take that every payroll run, put it in your spreadsheet, and then have a formula sort of auto calculate, where it just is, okay, take this number, 40% of it goes here and 60% of it goes here. That's one way that I've seen people do it. And I think, some people can say, oh, all my people work everywhere all the time. I can get that somebody can feel that way, but I have never found a circumstance yet where when we really sat down and looked at it, the process could not be rationalized and the expenses divided. I haven't seen it yet.
Sure. And as a follow-up to the sanitation and COGS question, a follow-up question. If you had a good way to separate the sanitation by department or team or sequence, would you assign it to COGS?
Yeah, I would. No, 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 no. Well, hold on. Let me think about that for a
I
second.
actually added some color to that. I added the department and sequence part. Let me re-ask it like verbatim. So if you had a good way to separate the sanitation, you would assign it to COGS.
I mean, I think if it were yes. I think if it were easy and obvious, sure. I don't see why that would be a bad idea.
Great. Okay, that's it for now for oh, yep, that's it for now for questions.
Okay, cool. So I'm just gonna move up one of these, since I said I was gonna do that for sanitation. Um, so there's one other thing that I was gonna mention is that it was as sort of as advertised, and I'm just gonna save this. Stop sharing that. And just as a way of looking at, um, if there's a lot of times where there are expenses that we want to look at, we want to consider buying a new piece of processing equipment. Sorry, I'm pulling up the thing here. If I can just find it. And um, And the question, and you look at the price tag on all these things, and oh, geez, they are so expensive. Everything costs, 10 to $200,000. And it's sort of remarkable if you break that down into, well, what's the cost per day? And so here is hopefully folks can see that this is this new expenditures decision, and I have two examples that are here. One is add new stuffer, like a new, nice new vacuum stuffer for $75,000 or whatever. And what is the price of an additional QA person at $45,000 all in? And that number actually is in a little slide I haven't used in a little while. That number feels low because everything just costs more these days, especially people. But for the sake of conversation, just using these numbers, this column of small labeled here is just some general expenses from a sort of made up budget. And sorry, this is part of a larger presentation, so that's why that's there. But the important parts here are on these columns. I don't know if folks can see my mouse. Does that show up as I move it? Okay. The important parts are if you buy a major piece of equipment and you take the loan interest plus the depreciation, and you divide it by the number of working days in the year, which is 254, assuming that you use it all those days, because if you only buy something and use it once a week or once a month, obviously this math is not right. The cost per day is often surprisingly low. And that is, I think, a good way of making those decisions. So in this case of this add new stuffer, where the loan interest on it is $2,500, and the depreciation expense on the item is $7,143. And it should be, somebody can double check my math if they want to, that if you divide that by 254, you should get $38 per day. And so if you use it 5 days a week, all year long, you only need to make $38 in additional revenue to break even on that expenditure. And in the case of a lot of pieces of equipment that offer more automation of often manual processes that nobody particularly likes to do anyway, the additional revenue that you need to bring in terms of more throughput, making more product, it's often surprising how little that is. And I do think the stuffer example is a great example, because it's like, well, that's not to say that the machine is going to run flawlessly for 10 years and you're not going to have any other costs associated with running it, because it will break down, things will happen, and the repairs probably won't be that cheap. But from the standpoint of, do you think you could make more than $38 a day in additional revenue by virtue of adding this equipment? If you have the business to justify that, it's a pretty good decision. So I think that is the kind of thing. Some people will say, well, I want this return on investment and I need it to pay back really, really quickly. And I think the question is not always well phrased in that sort of, well, how many years is the payback of the ROI? It's like, well, what's the real cost to your business from having this? Because especially if you're using a bunch of financing, the ROI is not a relevant question. It's not the right question. It's what's the cost of the money to get that? What's the cost of the equipment to your business, which are depreciation and interest? And looking at those over the term of the loan and a 10-year amortization or a 10-year depreciation schedule for the equipment, you come up with a different number that I think is the logical way of approaching it, and oftentimes leads to the conclusion that, gosh, that's really not that expensive. And if we think we can make that much money by adding this piece of equipment, let's do it. So the same thing is said about adding additional position. I used this QA because it's an indirect position. It's not contributing towards more revenue. But one of the things that it might be contributing to is that new QA person might help you get through the third-party audits that you've been not wanting to do or not have the time to take care of, that then allows you to bring in some additional business, and hopefully, justify the expense uh, of 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 adding that additional labor. And the daily impact of that on $45,000, which is just the number used here as an example, divided by all the work days of the year, is $177. So, I don't know whether that's the right or the wrong answer for people to say yes to, but it is, I think, a logical way of looking at those types of expenditures and investments. So, hope that makes sense.
I've got a handful of questions here.
Great.
Couple in the DMs, couple in the Q&A box. So first one, can you explain depreciation in this context?
So depreciation in this context is take the cost of the item, and you will probably want on a piece of equipment, most pieces of equipment, 10-year straight line depreciation is the most common method that I've seen for pieces of meat processing equipment. Um, buildings are on a different schedule. So 10-year straight line means 10% of the total price of that item is deducted from your profits, usually on an annual basis. Usually the depreciation entries, oftentimes come from your accountant. They keep track of the schedule and they give it to you. One caveat with that is just that your accountant may expense things somewhat differently. The set of books that you may keep regarding depreciation for taxes may differ from the set of books you keep that is your operational sort of managerial profit and loss, because many items these days can be advanced depreciated under this Section 179 rules that allow you to save on your taxes. There's a lot to that, but I'll leave it at that.
If there's deeper questions on those things, folks can book free time with you under the MPPTA grant on our website for the deeper lore.
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah, happy to talk about those kinds of things. Yeah.
Next question. When you're talking about the $38 a day, is that $38 margin that you need to make additionally?
Yes, it is margin that you need to make additionally. One of the things to think about, though, is that if you are ultimately, it is margin, but if you can bring in more revenue and hold most of the other costs the same, the revenue becomes margin pretty easily. So, but yes, the fine answer is yes, that's true, and that's important to note.
So depending on your margin, that may be more or less throughput to achieve that number.
Correct.
Great. Okay. Do you practice open book management?
So currently at the co-op that I'm the director of, we do. Yeah, we close the books once a month, and we have a meeting with all the staff, and we review the P&L and we talk about it. And the more we do that, the more people have better questions about it.
Yeah, that's an incredible practice, especially when it comes to many of us have plants with people who are new to the industry, who are young supervisors, young operators that want to grow, and open book management is just such an incredible way to educate everybody and get everyone on the same page and be invested.
Yep.
In what we're
I
doing.
think yeah, it's very helpful. Like I said, the questions get better and better. I think the even if people don't have big questions that they're asking every month, it's really been made clear that they really appreciate seeing the information, having access to it in a way that they feel trusted and appreciated and part of the team in a way that has been really cool to see.
I work with a lot of small processors like this. What would you say to the small processing business owner who is very old school doesn't want to show the books to the crew because it's none of their business, or they're not making as much money as they'd like to, or they're worried about what the books say and how the crew will perceive that. What do you say to business owners or leaders who are afraid of open book management?
It's a personal decision. It definitely can be a scary thing. I don't. I've found that from a team building standpoint and making or having people feel like they understand what's going on, they're part of the business and part of the process. I found that to be very helpful in making them feel included. Um, if it also is, we had an issue at Grand State this last summer where we had a direct lightning strike, some refrigeration blew up, and we had a bunch of meat spoil, and we had a $20,000 insurance claim associated with that. So seeing the process of that claim, of which we had a significant deductible, and how that impacted the bottom line, that was not a good month. And but to show that to everybody and walk them through it and have them understand it, it does feel better to have everybody on the same page and knowing why things are happening. I know that sometimes it can feel very scary when things aren't going as well and you don't want to talk with anybody about it. That said, also if people have books that are not that well organized, or we're all creatures of habit. I wouldn't want to push anybody to do anything that they're not comfortable with. The next move that we're going to make at some point, we're talking about it, we haven't done it yet, is is more wage transparency. Um, and ultimately, I think it's the right place to go, because I think it's going to make it such that the wages are fairer and the conversation is more even. Because right now, people talk about their wages. I mean, it's sort of inevitable that and so, if one person is making more because of some weird historical reason than other people, or another person is making less, if we have greater transparency and everybody has the same information, the conversations get a lot easier. Because right now it's hard to say, like, well, so and so makes this, and it's like, well, you're in somebody's review, you can't talk about that. Like, it's almost like everybody knows it, but they can't. It's like not fair game. And so once we have greater transparency, we can say, well, both from, hey, you're a little behind. Some other people are doing the same thing as you, and we actually do need to give you a good raise. And we as a company want that to be right. Assuming that person's doing a good job, you want them to feel valued. You don't want them to feel like they're the second class citizen, underpaid or whatever. And same thing goes the other direction. If somebody's kind of overpaid and they're like, well, I really need a raise, you're like, well, you're kind of above everybody else who's doing the same thing that you are. And so really appreciate your work, but how the wage scale works here, and I'm sorry there's not going to be a raise this year. And you and feel comfortable in saying that, and not feel like you're telling somebody a horrible thing or that they're a bad person, but you are clearly communicating in this reason why. And it's a reasonable thing, and it's supported by everybody else in the building. So we're not there yet, but that's an aspiration that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think in a time when employee engagement is it's harder to foster than ever, maybe, or it's just different, a little bit different. I think that open book management goes a long way, and wage transparency goes a very long way towards that. But it also teaches, it teaches department supervisors or even operators how their decisions impact the bottom line. It's
Mhm.
like they see it's applicable science. Like this is what people in our community do. We learn by seeing and by doing, rather than there are a lot less didactic learners in our group. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic method. I really appreciate what you had to say about wage transparency. It's not something we hear a lot in this industry, but we hear it a lot in other industries. So I think we're coming around. The other question,
Yeah.
how do you operationalize the financials? Meaning, do you translate the financial numbers to the plant floor personnel? So just kind of to expand upon what you were
Great
just talking about.
Great question. So, the way, and I didn't get into this as much, but when I was talking about the departmental accounting, looking at those gross margin, um, So it's good to have some margin goals for the department, and I think tracking them by department and presenting that information to see how you're doing is how I operationalize that. And oftentimes what I see is if a department is um, doing great, it prompts you to sort of, hopefully like ask, look into that a little bit more, like, but also know that it's going really well. If one department, if you start to see margins suffer, in a department, you can start to dig into, well, what's changed? Why is that? Likewise, if it's also getting better, well, what's changed? So we want to do, as is sort of typically said, right? We want to do more of the things that perform better and less of the things that don't perform as well. And so it prompts you to dig into often the specific billable items and processes. And it's possible that something is a great project for you, in which case you're like, great, how do we get more of that business? And it's possible that some particular product that you're making or process is not a great product, which means that either it's inappropriately priced and you need to maybe do some specific costing, which the way that I've typically done costing is by make several batches of an item and do some time trials about the amount of labor that went into that item, and then also an assessment of what raw materials you needed to provide. Did you need to provide casings? Were there seasonings that you needed to provide it? What were the packaging materials costs? And then looking at, what's your cost? What are you, to make that item? What's your price that you're charging for it? And how does that compare to the margin goal that you've set for that department? And margin goals are usually based on historically how does stuff go in that department? What are normal margins? I mean, for example, I have often seen that in areas of, if you take slaughter and cutting together, that the margins that we're going to see is around 45% in that kind of department in terms of gross margin. In other departments, I think 30 to 35% is more common. That would be further processing, sausage making, smoked and cured items. That's my experience. It may be different in other people's plants, but just to put some concrete numbers on things that I've seen. And so we try to evaluate the products that are meeting or exceeding those margin goals and the ones that aren't, and figure out how to do more of the ones that are better and less of the ones that are worse, or charge more for them.
Great. I'm going to take a quick pause on questions if there's so we can kind of be out of your way for the rest of your presentation. For just,
Well, I mean, I have some specific things that I
oh,
can show
great.
people. I haven't, but otherwise it's sort of like open the floor, and we can
Awesome.
talk about some of these things I presented, or open questions.
Yeah, let's do it. Anybody who has questions about margins, about finance, about plant management, costing, any of those things, please join us. I've got some questions that were sent to me via Instagram beforehand from some of our usual attendees who couldn't make it today, but I'd love to, before diving into those, field questions from the audience. Sierra.
I have just, I guess, like a basic general question, but do you prefer to do your bookkeeping in Excel, or do you prefer to like muddle your way through QuickBooks?
Well, I definitely I prefer QuickBooks at this point. I've used it a lot. I have used some other accounting softwares that I've used some, Sage Business Works and some other things like that. And QuickBooks, like so many things, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And so I feel comfortable enough with QuickBooks at this point. I have used it both Mac and PC, and there are some differences. In particular, I like it much better from uh, asset management standpoint. It's one thing just to manage a P&L in a spreadsheet, and that's relatively doable. But when you start having asset classes, the spreadsheet is a poor tool for that. And having real something with a general ledger that track of those asset classes, um, you know, and depreciation associated with them, especially you add in things like accruals. It's like that. It's very difficult to do in a spreadsheet.
And then I guess a follow-up question, is it, I guess to learn QuickBooks, is it best to, go ahead and pay for a class or work your way through like YouTube tools and try to teach yourself?
I think like many things, it's really what works best for you and, knowing yourself. I'm the kind of person who just likes to hit my head against the wall over and over again until I figure it out. But other people like to take a more graceful way where they go to a class. So that's,
Great, thank you.
yeah.
Okay, I've got a couple more that were sent to me. What do you do about labor when you have to keep your team full time, but don't have the throughput to keep labor within an acceptable percentage? So I'm assuming this could be, many, as you know very well, Arion, many of our small and very small establishments are subject to heavy seasonality, right? We haven't quite
Totally.
grown with the small producers. That's a whole other conversation. I'm not even going to touch that. But yeah, so seasonality is a challenge. Startups who are on that kind of 2 to 3 year path to fill the plant up. What do you do?
It's a great question, and I think some things that I personally have done that I found to be successful are offering. One is offering seasonal pricing discounts. So, in the Northeast, when I was running Vermont Packing House, February through April were our slow months, and we would offer a 10% discount on processing charges to any producers who booked animals during those months. And I don't want to say it was like a panacea, but we did get real movement. And there were people who were like, "Oh, you're full in December, but you'll give me a slot at 10% less in February." Yes, I will hold those animals longer. I'll have more feed costs and a little labor associated with them, but I'll get a slot that I want. And I think, and they come out slightly ahead because of the reduced processing charges. So driving business that direction with financial incentives is one thing that I have seen work to a degree. The other thing that I have done um, is, you know, some people are super stoked to leave early, and so there's work, it's trying to make it that there's work available if you want to stay, but if you want to leave early, that's okay too. And offering that ability of self-selection, because somebody who, let's say they're a younger person with not a lot of overhead, they may be excited to get out early. And somebody else who, maybe they're the sole breadwinner or they have children at home and a significant amount of overhead. They need the hours, they need the hours to pay their bills, and making those hours available to them. And that's also sometimes to say, well, there's a special project. We're going to do a deep cleaning on this thing. But making it up to them about options to get more hours, that's been that those are a couple of strategies that have worked well for me.
Okay, great. I'll keep rolling until some more questions pop in. When buying equipment, is it best to buy something much larger to grow into, or is it best to grow incrementally, upgrading equipment multiple times over the years? How do you make that decision? So, for example, this question came from somebody on Instagram. This gives me this throws back to an organization that I'm aware of that wants to expand their grind operation in a very large way. Today, they have a Gemini setup of 2 grinders with 400-pound hoppers, and they can probably, let's say they can produce 5,000 pounds a day. Let's just say that. They'd like to scale to 20 to 25,000 pounds, which is a significantly larger grind line. They have not identified that customer yet, but they feel that that customer's out there, and they also feel that if they got that contract, it would really change. It would turn the ship around. It would really cover the delta of where they want to be. What do you do? How do you look at that, Arion?
It's a great question. I think there's a couple of factors that are in flux, or that are sort of one is how confident are you that the business will grow there? And I think we've all been in a position where with new customer business where somebody promised us the world and they didn't show up with it. And so and then there's also some people who call you and they say, hey, next year I'm going to do this. And that's what's going to happen. Like their commitments are good and they will be there with what they promised. And so there's the evaluation of the likelihood of that. And I think within that context, it's kind of like somebody once said to me, build the biggest building you can afford. Um, and I see this as a little bit of a similar thing within the context. If you're sure about the business potential that's there, get the biggest machine you can afford. Um, and there are some things where it's like with the grinders, you can certainly get bigger machines. Um, uh, but you also want to make sure that the car only goes as fast as the slowest wheel turns, right? And so you could grind 25,000 pounds, but can you package it and get it out the door? That's keeping things lined up with each other is always an important consideration.
Okay, I'm going to keep rolling from this pool of questions. Okay. Have you implemented incentive pay for crews before, like bonuses or whatever incentive it may be? If so, how do you approach that?
The answer is yes. I have tried a few different incentive programs over the years. The issue there's only one of the issue with many of them is that the administration of them can be so complicated that it really becomes a challenge in the sense of like if incentives are based upon pounds of throughput or number of head or that kind of thing, the specific administration of them, doing the math every week or every payroll, um, it, it can be really challenging because there's also just the variables become overwhelming. How many people were that day? Did one person call out? Did the machine break down? All of a sudden the machine broke down, so everybody's behind. They were there, but they were working. And then what do you do? And so all of those little exceptions um, became unmanageable. The one incentive program that I've ever done that I liked and would stick with is what I call the attention to detail program, which basically was on a departmental basis, had large categories such as were there and it was on a week to week basis, and everybody got an extra buck so $40 a week um, for meeting these categories. One of them was product quality. Were there quality defects? Another one was safety. Was anybody hurt or any equipment damaged? Um, were there sanitation deficiencies? And part of that was just cleaning up the workday at the end of the day. And those kinds of things, there are majors and minors, and there's lots to that. But because it was on a departmental basis, it also allowed people, if somebody was doing something in a way that didn't work well, it impacted everybody in the department. So there became this element of peer pressure where it was like, well, yeah, it is your business if that person's messing this up because they're messing it up for everybody else. And the other thing that it really, so if they're doing something that's unsafe, if they're not making the product correctly, everybody knew that this would come back on them as a full department. And the other thing that it really helped out with was set up at the beginning of the day and clean up at the end of the day. People were much more responsible and weren't just like, boy, they were out the door and coats were everywhere and plastic bags were spilled all over the place. And it's like, okay, folks got written up on that one enough times and it really changed it. So, and it became easy to implement because it was, if there was an issue, it got written up. If there was no issue, everybody got the bonus. And so from from a management standpoint, it was simpler. That's one of those. Anyway, that's my experience.
Sure. Sounds like some group accountability is at play there, and I've seen that work in plants that I've managed as well. I'm going to keep rolling with them, everybody. We've got 18 minutes before our hard stop. So if you have any questions that you're thinking about asking, go ahead and raise your hand or pop it in the chat. Arion, what's a short question? What's a good percentage for labor?
It depends on I tend the numbers that I have in my head are that I mentioned that sort of 45% margin in cutting and slaughter and 35% in further processing. The majority of those expenses are going to be associated with labor. Sometimes in the further processing, you can have some ingredient costs that are higher. But when you're talking about slaughter and cutting, yes, some packaging materials cost money, but the overwhelming majority of that is labor. So that tends to be how I look at it on those department basis. I wouldn't, does that mean that the cost of labor is most of that?
35 to 45%, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Well, so that would be the margin. So I would say, your cost on labor and cutting and slaughter, maybe 50% of the revenue.
Mm-hmm.
With let's say 45% with another 10% for packaging, and then and on further processing, you're probably looking at something like, of your total revenue, um, your cost for late, you're gonna have much more you're gonna have more materials costs. So probably something still in that 45-50% kind of range.
Yeah, as I like to say, value adds are not always value adds. I managed a value added RTE plant that did everything from charcuterie to bacon and cooked sausages, and have also managed very small establishments that have a smoke program. And we always think that because there's an additional service fee, that's going to be a value add, but that's not always the case, especially if, activity-based costing. If we don't know that, like to your point earlier, if we're not doing time studies, if we're not really accounting for all of the costs, and we're just simply benchmarking our service fees off our neighbors. I mean, I work with people
Hmm.
every day that say, yeah, I charge $1.75 for bacon as a service fee because that's what everybody in the area does. Or everybody
Hmm.
else in the area does $1.75 and I do $1.50. And that doesn't, does that does that really work? Because are you really able to produce bacon for that? I know people out here that are still charging 80 cents a pound to process beef. You can't put 80 you can't put beef in a package for 80 cents a pound with wages
Hmm.
today and packaging costs today, but they're still doing it because it's competitive. So that's like a slippery slope. I don't know if you have any thoughts
Yeah,
on that.
well, just yeah, I mean, I think totally knowing where your costs are, just because other people are charging that, or that's what I mean, one, you can't be totally out of whack with the market that's around you, but it's better to not do something for a loss. It's better to not do something that you're losing money at than to do it. And if the market won't bear that price, that's a different conversation of whether you should be doing it.
Exactly.
Because yeah, doing more volume where you lose money on every pound, that's you're not helping anybody. Um, the it is because the line items that you charge more for, there's this perception of like, oh well, gosh, we charge $2 a pound for that. That's got to be a good item. It really is a false logic. The logic of, well, what can you do a lot of? That the price per pound is less important than the volume that you're able to move. And I think the classic example of that is actually fabrication, where you're cutting, particularly cutting beef, somewhat cutting pork, where it's like, oh my God, like you might not be charging a ton, you might be charging way less for this item, but the number of carcass pounds you can move in a day, it is so much more than anything else that you're doing. And so the revenue, the actual margin that you generate is significantly more. And so that the accounting emphasis on, what's the volume you can both, bring in from a business demand standpoint and also actually accomplish in the day are, sometimes almost more important than the specific price you're charging.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, makes perfect sense. I got a question from Adasha. Can you provide insight on audited financial findings and areas to be aware of when accounting for meat packing?
Um, I
And we
wonder
can
if
ask for
Adasha
clarity if yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if Adasha maybe just wants to speak and ask that question with a little more clarity? Just what's I'm not totally sure what the question is. Natasha, are you able to provide a little more clarity there?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm off. No, just getting into hi and thank you. Probably
Hi.
have to hit you up on some individual time. But we were going for like whole chicken, right? Raising it and just selling whole chicken. Now that we're getting into processing and are there any things that we need to line item or be aware of specifically to meat processing, you know, comes to like financial audits and things that we need to have. I also asked for kind of the template of your chart of accounts to make sure that we don't miss anything as we're building this component and this added value component out on our operations. So things
Sure.
that people
Well,
think, that are normal and typical, but then on audits, it's like something that's often missed.
yeah, I mean, depending, if you are if you're actually doing a full financial audit, that's not a fun process. So hopefully you can, just go with reviewed statements or something like that. But I think one thing in terms of how building a chart of accounts when you are a meat producer that also has a processing operation is to make sure that the processing operation stands alone as a financially sound entity. And what I mean by that is that the processing operation is billing the farm or the branded meat company or whatever, however it's organized, uh, appropriate processing charges, that it has its own expenses and it is covering those expenses. Because you see sometimes where people build a processing facility and they don't adequately charge their branded meat company, but they say, oh gosh, well, we own this now, so it's going to charge us less, it's going to give us a really good deal on our processing charges. And then they do that and they say, well, gosh, why is this processing company suck so much? Why is this just like it's just losing money all the time? Well, it's because you're robbing Peter to pay Paul in that situation. And so I think that that's one thing, that just because you own the processing company does not mean that they should not charge you market rates for processing. In fact, it's really important that they do. And if it makes a bunch of money, it can return that to the processing company. You can maybe slightly give it a price discount or just return it back to the ownership because you own it. But it's really important that you're not engaging in some false intercompany accounting there that gives the wrong picture. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I definitely have seen some very some alarming intercompany transactions over the years. We just have a couple of minutes left, and if anybody wants to expand on anything we've talked about, please pop them into the chat. I've got one more question from the audience who's not here today. Actually, let's follow up with Adasha first. This will be my last question. Adasha, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, like, if it was because we're such a small organization company and we're growing. I'm already at a separated nonprofit, education component to our farming process, and there's a lot of like the same people doing a lot of different. I might take you up on that offer as like someone's in the same doing a little bit of everything, and I was like, yeah, that's us. But is there an element that's not alarming, as a small company, 2 or 3 years into it, where there's some crossover in that? Is there I know, as you grow, things are more defined and you get into the accounting and things are, like you said, kind of consolidated into line items. But like what would be the best way or best practice? I said that wouldn't be so alarming, but it's kind of like a natural cause of evolution within a business. I'm at that point
To
where it's
keep
like right before you realize that you need to be a separate business. You know what I mean? It's like going, okay.
yeah. Yeah, I think the best thing you can do in that circumstance is pick a percentage of those people's time that on average feels like the right percentage. In any given week, it might not be totally perfect, but if on average it's perfect, it's going to give you a reasonable financial picture about what's happening. Does that make sense?
Right, not just people, but like spaces as well, right? But yeah.
Mm. Yeah, well, yeah, and I would suggest actually, you have some really specific questions. I would say if you wanted to go in through the book and book technical assistance person, I'd be happy to dig into some of those specifics. We could find some time, or you could,
Okay, and then I asked
uh,
for you
yeah,
specifically, right?
yeah. My name's there. I'm also, or you could just email me. I'm putting my email
Okay.
address in the chat right now.
And that's a
Thank you. I
great
appreciate it.
Great question,
Yeah,
Adasha. Just so everybody knows, I just
yeah,
popped a link in the chat. That takes you right to our web page that shows all of our consultants that are available and their specialties, and you can hop on their Calendly and schedule time with them. It's 30-minute chunks at a time for your intro call, but you're able to transition that into a longer term, whether it's 2 hours or 4 hours or even 10 hours total through our peer-to-peer consulting program, which we'll also have more information about on that web page. So yeah, the links there, please take us up on it. It's money that the government has already given. It's already been paid for. There's no catch. Just enjoy getting free technical assistance and please make use of that.
yeah. Great.
I've got one more question. Let's see if I can pull it up. Okay. I was just hired as a new plant manager. This plant is a mess. It's a poor culture. It's underperforming financially. The quality is bad, and we can't keep people around. What are the first three things that I should be focusing on as a plant manager to get this thing under control? I'm paraphrasing, leaving out actual names and facility names.
Gosh,
Uh,
boy, that's a lot.
that's a lot. Maybe that's
You
a good
know,
NPPTA question.
yeah, I think some of the specifics on that are important just because, I certainly am not debating any of those points, but to understand them a little more richly, I do think that I do think that the culture of the staff and is a good place to start to make sure that um, people give a damn, that they're showing up, and that there is it just that's the center of the business, is how those folks show up and the quality and conscientiousness that they put into the work that they do. um and and especially as a plant manager, to build that morale and credibility with the staff is a really important thing. But it does sound like there's a lot to that question, so I don't know if I would go. I'm not sure if extrapolating further is really helpful, but I think focusing on that staff culture and morale is a really important piece.
And I know
I don't
that's
know.
a
What do you think? What do you think, David? Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I know that's a huge question. I left it for the end because I think there's so many people that can relate to that, and that I think warrants a bigger conversation. And there's some things in the work for maybe a plant manager working group, like support group, where we get together and kind of bounce ideas off the wall. Stay tuned for details on that. My take on that is, to your point, people sussing out who's there, what the engagement level is, what do they need, what have they been missing, right? And a lot of times
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
leader who is involving them in open book management, who's involving them in the business, who's not just people are clocking in and clocking out and treating it like an agricultural side activity or game processing in Uncle John's garage, right? Like we're meat processors and it's manufacturing,
Yeah.
and culture is so important.
Yeah, and pride in that, and also, like, well, what are, if people are feeling um apathetic, are there things, what it may be, and it sometimes happens that they've been asking for things and not getting them, and so they feel like they're not cared for, so why do they care? And if they're, sometimes you can get some quick wins with just, gosh, this thing's been broken forever, or we've been asking for this, and just, having some wins there can build some real credibility. And sometimes also, people don't ask for things because they know that it doesn't go anywhere, but when it starts going somewhere, it prompts them to ask for other things that can really help bring the business in the right direction, and just start that positive communication and building those positive feedback loops.
Sure. And I have erred on the side of spending too much time on training and culture and not enough time on getting expenses under control. So I would say, that's a huge one. But also, if you're kind of a one-person show and you're coming into this mess, I've done this before. I also highly recommend getting a grip on the facility and the equipment. Has it been maintained? How long has it been since a PM program has been performed on that roll stock machine? Is it performing correctly? I would get a handle on facility and equipment. I also want to know, what is the strength of the financial acumen in the company? I'm not an accountant, but I am a plant manager, and I generally like to have someone on the team, whether it's a CFO or a controller or an accountant, who is my financial partner, who is helping me as I'm trying to fix the culture and work on getting the equipment under control and so many other things in the plant. I need somebody there, or would prefer to have someone there, who can kind of say, like, yeah, David, that sounds great, but you got to spread that out over the next 24 months. That plan's just, we're not doing that in Q1, right? So for me, it's like, who's my partner? What's the financial situation? What's the chart of accounts look like? Is it clean? Is it not? How much work do we have to do there? Taking a look at the facility and then taking a look at the culture. I guess that's kind of where I would probably start in triage mode. But it all just depends on when you walk. Every plant's different, right? Walk in the door and it's all different.
What are the specifics? Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, we're at the end of our time for today. I thank you, everybody who is here and who isn't here, for all the fantastic questions. Arion, this has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for the conversation. Really appreciate you facilitating, David, and thank you everybody who showed up for your questions. And feel free to reach out through the technical assistance one or email me. Yeah, fun conversation, and I'm glad that some people can geek out on this kind of stuff like I do. So.
Yeah, well, thank you for starting NPAN.